Thank you, Gerard, for inviting me, and thank you for Adam and Ellen for organizing this fantastic meeting. I'm in one of the largest and oldest schools of medicine in the United Kingdom, and I would like to share with you some of our results with omega-3 fatty acids in one of the hardest indications in neurology, which is neurotrauma. So, if I may move this. I would like to say a few words about trauma in the context of modern medicine, then show you some data we have on omega-3 fatty acid in spinal cord injury. We are planning to move this to the first studies in man within 18 months. And then perhaps some thoughts at the end, if I have time, a time perspective for drug development in this area and fatty acids. Now, why clinical translation neurotrauma in our hospital? It's one of the busiest trauma centers in the world, and it is becoming now certainly the busiest in Europe, with at least 2,000, 2,200 major trauma patients every year. And it is possible to see these patients within the first, actually the exact figure is 12 minutes after major trauma using the helicopter emergency service. So, trauma remains the biggest killer of children and young adults. The age range is something like between 16 and 40 years old. And the outcomes for major trauma remain poor in Western Europe, as poor as they are in Africa. Major trauma is linked to permanent disability. One of the major sources of permanent disability is brain injury in particular, so central nervous system injury. And there is a need for a true paradigm shift in the management of neurotrauma. So I would like to focus on spinal cord injury and to illustrate the work we've done in the last 5 years or so in this indication. But we cover, I would say, neurotrauma in our group in a 360 degrees manner. I will not have time to discuss other aspects. I have just said that the management of neurotrauma remains a big problem, trauma in general, neurotrauma in particular. And this is a famous Egyptian papyrus. The Egyptian said, when you examine a man with a dislocation of a vertebra of his neck, then you have to say a disease one cannot treat. And I'm not sure we've moved a lot since then. So what is the problem? And this illustrates a cervical lesion, for example. The type of trauma to the spinal cord which can occur either in a civilian context, major accidents, terrorist attacks, natural disasters, or a military context. And what happens is that in the first minutes after injury, there is an irreversible destruction of the cord. But what is really determining the outcome for patients is the spread of the injury to healthy tissue. And this spread is like a wildfire. It involves very complex processes, loss of neurons, loss of glial cells. There is active infiltration of neutrophils. Charlie Serhan has just mentioned this concept of activation of inflammatory response. It's interesting to see presence of inflammatory cells from the periphery in the cord. And gradually the cord is destroyed. And this is the typical appearance of a cord, both in animals and in humans after major spinal cord trauma. So what is happening in molecular and cellular terms is extremely complex, and it's impossible to take in all this slide. But the point made by this slide is that the timeline is extremely important. And here, like in stroke, I would say even more than in stroke in the context of traumatic mechanical injury, the golden hour is essential, intervention as fast as possible. And in the seconds to minutes after neurotrauma, one of the most interesting and important events is the development of extreme hyperexcitability. There are other events like vascular changes, which are very dramatic, but there are parallel events which, for example, involve excitatory neurotransmitters. And there are tremendous discharges in the area around the injury, extreme neuronal hyperexcitability involving ion channels, which leads me to a question which I will not have time to. Zan and Dr. Sahan a moment ago, the fact that DHA has a multitude of targets, apart from the metabolic transformations which give rise to another level of complexity. And ion channels are very important, both sodium channels and potassium channels. And it's very interesting to note that one of the most important channels recognized by DHA is a channel which is activated by pressure, by stretch, by mechanical distraction forces. And distraction and laceration and compression is what is happening in traumatic spinal cord injury, for example. So this involvement of potassium channels like the TREC1 channels is very likely. In fact, we have some data on this which are likely to come out this year. So what about clinical translation then of omega-3 fatty acids in neurotrauma? So how do you carry out clinical translation in this indication? You've got to mimic injury in animals, and you've got to do it in a variety of ways because no single model of neurotrauma is perfect. And you've got to use a variety of approaches, including section of nerve fibers, for example, in hemisection models. You can compress the cord from above, for example, the type of accident you have when you have compression by a beam in a mine accident. And you can also have contusive forces. You can use a contusion model. And we're using all these models. I'm going to show you some data in these models. The data have been published, so I will go. I'm very aware of the time, so I would like to go very fast over data which you can find because they're out in the literature now. So the first set of results we obtained was in hemisection injury, where we showed that, surprisingly, at an extremely low dose of DHA, less than 0.1 milligrams per kilo injected intravenously, which is something the emergency team can do within the first hour after injury, we have a dramatic reduction in the lesion size. And this was also, to our surprise, correlated with a very significant preservation of myelin. Myelin is important. It was mentioned yesterday as the insulating layer around axons, around nerve fibers. And this is extremely important in the spinal cord. So let's make it even more difficult for DHA to be efficacious. We looked at a very severe model, which is a compression model in a second step towards translation. And here, as you can see, there is a very extensive destruction of the cord in time over 4 weeks. And this time we combine this very small dose, intravenous dose of DHA, with sustained exposure in the diet. Animals were put back in the cage after injury, and they could eat between 300 and 400 milligrams per kilo freely in the diet for several weeks. And what we saw was exactly the same story. And I will just show you an example for those who are not familiar with this concept of cavitation in the spinal cord. When you have a spinal cord injury, the spinal cord goes into a process of self-destruction, and the same happens in rodents, in rats in particular. And when we treated the animals with DHA, the results in both DHA groups were phenomenal. There is no cavitation. And this happens both after a single intravenous bolus or bolus plus sustained exposure, and very reduced inflammatory response. More to the point, there is preservation of the function of fibers. These deposits here, fluorescent signals in the cord after injury, show that the fibers cannot function, and proteins that are transported by fibers accumulate. They don't in the DHA-treated groups. And last but not least, how well you do after injury is a very legitimate question. And rats can be, and mice, and any other species can be submitted to a neurological examination, a variety of paradigms to study locomotor coordination and locomotor function. We are talking here about thoracic injuries. And what we saw was tremendous improvement after DHA. In the first week after injury, it's very clear that the non-treated animals are doing poorly. The DHA-treated animals, both groups, are doing very well. And this continues. The control animals do recover some function gradually. Not great, but the best group by far is the DHA combined treatment, in fact. This has been published already. Now, what are the requisite steps towards clinical translation? We have started discussing with European authorities fast translation in spinal cord injury, and we have written a protocol, and these are some of the essential points that need to be satisfied in order to gain credibility, to be able to move to clinical trials in this indication, which involves very fragile patients in the first 30 minutes to an hour after injury. And these patients would be treated, for example, on the motorway if they are found with a suspected spinal cord injury after a road accident. So we need to confirm efficacy in several models of injury at several segmental levels and confirm in several species. And various other points I will not have time to discuss. The second species is the work we've completed in the last 2 years, and it's coming out this year. It's exactly, to cut a long story short, it's a phenomenal protection in the mouse too. The mouse is different, will not respond to injury like a rat, has some features in common with human injury, doesn't have much cavitation, has a fibrotic scar. Humans can have fibrotic scars too. So again, here you have a neurological outcome after injury, and again, by far compared to the control group, the best group is the group treated either with DHA, acute bolus after injury, or bolus with diet combined. And this is supported by very fine subscore analysis. This is a very fine neurological analysis of recovery of limb function. So, final point, staying with the mouse. The question asked, especially by the military, and at present we are supported also by funds from the United States Department of Defense, is whether if you raise the level of omega-3 fatty acids, you protect against neurotrauma. And you see the obvious implications of this question. So we used, in a collaboration with Harvard Medical School, this fantastic mouse with high levels of omega-3 fatty acids in tissues. So if you give these animals higher levels of omega-6 fatty acids in the diet, they convert through a genetic modification these fatty acids, and they generate, for example, in the brain, which is very much important for us, higher levels of fatty acids in tissues. And again, to cut a long story short, the paper will be out this year. We see phenomenal resistance to injury in these animals. For example, this illustrates the protection of oligodendrocytes, which are very important cells for formation of myelin, for this insulating sheath. And the recovery in terms of neurological score is also very clearly much better. So these are control animals either on a standard diet or a diet slightly higher in omega-6, the good match for these transgenics. And these are the transgenics. For both score and subscore, these are star performance. So what about the chronic phase after injury? Well, we have a model now, and this is what we are working on. We are going to try and move, hopefully, to the first clinical studies with this fast intervention in the first hour after injury. But we have some evidence showing that as the patient is moved to the intensive care unit and then goes into rehab, there may be scope to continue exposure to omega-3 fatty acids, in particular DHA. Based on our work we've done so far, the work we've done so far, DHA remains a lead compound. I would like to say just 2 words about 2 other forms of neurotrauma. When this kind of thing happens, whether it's a tsunami or a road accident or military combat or elderly people falling downstairs, real trauma is messy and often is combined. And for example, spinal cord injury can occur in parallel with some mild brain injury or nerve crash or peripheral nerve injury. So do omega-3 fatty acids make any difference in other types of injury? And this is a report which has already been published from our group. We have looked at peripheral nerve injury. This particular type of trauma has its own challenges. Here you have the effect of sciatic nerve crush in wild-type mice, or these mice with high levels of omega-3 fatty acids. And this index of recovery, it's a withdrawal threshold which reflects sensory motor changes. You can see is much better. There is a very clear differential in the animal with high levels of omega-3 fatty acids in tissue. So there is no doubt, and we have more recent data showing there is clear potential in peripheral nerve injury. And last but not least, I think there are groups, including ours now, working on brain injury. The work, this wave of work on traumatic brain injury was certainly started by Julian Bales's report. This is one of his first papers. Here you see, again, these ailing axons after traumatic brain injury. And when he treated with DHA, he reported a much improved outcome. So my conclusion is that omega-3 fatty acids, the long-chain omega-3 fatty acids, and DHA in particular, have a significant, totally unexpected, in many ways, neuroprotective potential in trauma on a variety of indications. And perhaps it's important to bear in mind that at this point, the question could be, what is the strategy for development, especially for people who want to become involved in this type of work? I think this summarizes some of my, I think, ways of thinking about it. I think we need to be very specific, which compound, which regime of administration, what paradigm, and be absolutely sure that the scientific data is very strong. And I would like to finish with a time perspective. I started with history. I mentioned the Egyptians. And as a pharmacologist, I think it's very interesting to see that modern pharmacology, the last 100 years, have been very much influenced by Paul Ehrlich, the concept of a magic bullet, that we need a compound with a very clear mechanism of action, and this will solve a problem. And this has changed the face of medicine. But I think in many ways now we are learning that medicine is much more complex. We are talking about systems biology, and complex diseases, complex conditions like neurotrauma may require complex drugs. And I think DHA, in particular, for the scope of the discussion today, is a very complex drug. It has multiple targets. It can act as a parent compound. It can act through its metabolites. And I'm sure at least some of you have recognized John Vane. John Vane had the Nobel Prize for medicine for his work on the mechanism of action of aspirin and the arachidonic acid cascade and so on, which helped us understand how aspirin works. The first report on willow bark extract was this report by the Reverend Edmund Stone in the 18th century. And between the 18th century and 1982 or so, when John Vane got the Nobel Prize, we didn't really know fully how aspirin worked. I'm not sure we knew very much. But aspirin was used with much success and continues to be probably one of the most successful drugs in the history of medicine. So I guess I'm trying to say that DHA is a fascinating compound. Omega-3 fatty acids are fascinating compounds. They have complex pharmacology. We may not be able to define how they work and what the key drivers of their mechanism of action are in some complex indications like neurotrauma or even Alzheimer's disease, but this shouldn't stop work, shouldn't stop the attempt to take them to the clinic, make sure they are safe, but the potential of these compounds is tremendous. And I think you can help us make it happen for the people who are waiting for better answers in neurological conditions such as neurotrauma. I would like to thank you for your attention and to leave you with an image of my wonderful colleagues in the neurotrauma and neurodegeneration group, and more to the point, people in my group who have contributed to this work. Thank you for your attention.